now for something completely different. we have we have Songs from a Room by Leonard Cohen, released April 1969. It is number 27 in the rankings of overall ranking of albums from 1969. It was 923 overall in the 60s. And speaking of crossovers with David Crosby, he comes up here shortly too in Leonard Cohen's album. Leonard Cohen was a Canadian living outside of Montreal, and Songs from a Room is his second album. It was thought of as a letdown compared to his first album, which was Songs of Leonard Cohen, and released in 1968, I believe. And my initial thought was maybe this has to do with, a band having their whole lives to record their first album, but then not as much time to record their second. But the more I read about Leonard Cohen, I don't think that's true or that applies to him. He was already an established writer and poet before he even started making music. He was older than a lot of his contemporaries when he got into music. He was older than Dylan. He was older than Simon and Garfunkel and some of the other people that were around when he started recording. He was very successful, and he was a very influential singer-songwriter. He seemed like he was well respected and one of those musicians that all the other musicians really respected and appreciated. Probably also because of his poetry and writing, his novels that he had released. He had already had two novels come out before this album came out, and he had multiple books of poetry released. And that's what he was doing before he recorded his first and second albums. He got into music kind of at the urging of his friends or other musicians in Canada. And then he decided he really lived the artist life. He was, I read he was lived on a Greek island for a while with his first wife. He was just, smoking cigarettes and writing songs or writing poetry. And he had a kid at that time too, I think. And then he decided that he wanted to make country western album. And so then he went to New York and
where else would you go if you want to make a country western album, right, John?
Well, he got to Nashville eventually. That's where he recorded this album. But so he crossed paths with in New York. He crossed paths with Bob Dylan. I read he stayed at the same hotel that Janis Joplin was in. Lou Reed already knew about him from his writings, and he started performing live in 1967, and then that Songs from Leonard Cohen, for his first album, came out in '68. He was also signed to Columbia, like everyone else apparently, and he never stopped writing even after this album came out. He often had comparisons made. He was known as if anything, he was the lyrics person of all lyrics people. His lyrics were what everyone knew from his albums. Comparisons were made to Bob Dylan and Simon and Garfunkel. Specifically on this album, he didn't record it in New York. He went to Nashville for that, and David Crosby started production on this album until he was kicked off. And then the Dylan
surprise.
Yeah, and then the Dylan producer Bob Johnston came in, so that's another thematic tie-in, and finished the album with Cohen.
I might argue that might also explain the lack of critical success, because this album under David Crosby's hands would sound very different. Probably Matt would not like it, but I would argue that it might have been a piece that would have made this a very different album.
Yeah. Specifically about this album, well, before I talk about that, what are your guys' experiences with Leonard Cohen? And Matt, had you heard of this album before or listened to any Leonard Cohen?
Nope, not really. I didn't. I knew probably mostly I knew him through actually. First heard of him when I heard Jeff Buckley's version of Hallelujah, which I think Hallelujah might be his most well known song. It's just been covered so many times, and it was in the Shrek movie, so you got to know it's, a lot of people are aware of that, right? So, but I didn't. I knew that he's just a really well respected songwriter. But I never really listened to an album or anything, prior to that. So I was excited about that, kind of going into this. And even though not being a lyrics person, I actually consciously read through lyrics and, read through interpretations of lyrics to get some idea of what was going on here. So I think that helped with at least my understanding and of the album overall. But so that was kind of my background knowledge, which wasn't a whole. Actually, at one point I was thinking, was he in the Velvet Underground? And then I realized I was confusing him with John Cale. So I don't know why, but that's just where my mind went. So, but yeah.
What about you, John? Any experience playing?
I think that the first thing I always think of with Leonard Cohen, I am familiar with some of his work. I always think of him as an artist who basically wrote songs that were basically made to be covered. So in that way, he's similar to like a Tom Waits type to me, where the hook in is not necessarily his voice, it's the songs, but in many cases, Leonard Cohen songs pop up done by other people, and I always think they sound like a completely different song. Sometimes maybe better, sometimes maybe worse, but that, when I first think of Leonard Cohen, that's what I always think of, that he just writes songs that are destined to be covered by others.
My initial thoughts on this album, I never had any experience with Leonard Cohen either, other than knowing how he wrote Hallelujah, which is obviously a much covered song. But this album was really depressing and sad, and I guess that's what he's known for. I found it pretty mellow. A lot of the lyrics are kind of haunting, and it's a very introspective album. Melancholy would be a good word for it also. And my SAT word for this album would be austere. It's very stripped down. It's basically him in a room, with a guitar. There's not a lot of production.
Would you say the production is sparse, Josh? Would you say spare
yes.
or sparse? Yes.
Yes, I would. There's no other band members like what you guys had in your albums this week. It's just him. So he's not really known for his strong voice either, which I can pick up on this album. The lyrics are the primary foundation for that. I think people seemed like the critical consensus at the time was it might be too stripped down or too sad or more of the same from the first album. I guess the first album, I haven't listened to it yet because I'm trying to kind of silo myself off from exploring outward in that discography. But based on listening to this, I'm excited to listen to that album if it is so much better. I really like this album. I can't think of an instance where I would want to put it on, but I'm glad I listened to it. What did you guys think of the album? John, how about you?
I liked it. I didn't love it. I liked it. I think, like you said, it's not an album that I see myself revisiting. With that being said, you knew coming in the lyrics were going to be excellent. And I do, if you'll allow me the indulgence, I want to read a couple just because they're fantastic. I mean, in the song,
go for it.
You Know Who I Am, he writes, sometimes I see you naked, sometimes I need you wild, I need you to carry my children in, and I need you to kill a child. Just the way that sounds, I mean, Leonard Cohen was a very good writer in his own right, and like Josh, I'm trying to silo out from other influences, but I did check out some of his poetry, because that's an interest of mine, and he is an actually legitimately good poet, unlike a lot of folks in the 60s who thought of themselves as poets, but were legitimately not good poets. And that just sounds incredible. Even small little couplets like, I am the one who loves changing from nothing to one. Just sounds great. The sparseness of the production really helps in those songs that are powerhouses. There are, though, lots of songs where, ironically, a David Crosby, some pop sensibility would be very well received. The Butcher comes to mind. That just is, at his worst, I think, on this album, a lot of his songs sound like dirges. They're repetitive. They drone. The Jew's harp just becomes, I don't want to say unbearable, but it punctuates the songs and gives it emotional resonance, but I would argue that the songs by themselves have enough emotional resonance, and it sort of feels at times, if the Byrds were layering their music, I feel this was the equivalent of layering for Leonard Cohen, but I don't know if it's as successful for me. It feels like piling on the melancholy feel Josh explained. But Matt, what do you think?
My overall take of this album from when I initially heard it, and it still is, it sounds cool. Like it sounds, I get why people like his voice isn't great, but I think it's great for what he's using it for and what he's doing with it. I like the stripped down nature of it. I like the vulnerability of it, and it was accentuated more by when I actually read through the lyrics. Surprise, surprise, that like I took more out of it. A lot of biblical themes through this. A lot of themes of love, and pain, and it just. I don't know. I really thought it just sounded. I thought it sounded great for what it was. I don't think it needed. I mean, it would be interesting to hear if someone like Crosby or somebody else produced it that added more to it. But I don't necessarily think that is something that's really needed here. Having said all that, I probably would agree with what Josh says. Like, I'm glad I know this album. I don't know how often I would reach for it though. Like, I think it's a really particular. Like, I don't know. I'd have to be through like certain times. It's good for certain times in certain places. But
one of the great things about this, I think, is now that we're starting to put albums next to each other. We had Townes Van Zandt and we had Bob Dylan last week. And what I would say about this album compared to them is the Townes Van Zandt album for me resonated much stronger for me personally, emotionally. The lyrics were great in this album, and it feels like at times Leonard Cohen is directly speaking to you, even in terms of how it sounds, like how it's recorded. But I never felt the emotional connection that I felt to the Townes Van Zandt album, where like I was able to embody his pain. It was always a little, as I think the coolness that you were hearing, Matt, was like detachment for me to some degree, which is so bizarre because it sounds like he's talking to you, but I didn't feel it emotionally resonate like in my bones. And compared to like someone like Bob Dylan, who just layered those songs and those narratives with that bass line, which just, even when there was a song that maybe got Birds, there'd always been the bass lines. That's where I feel like the David Crosby influence and some pop sensibility would have really helped this album. Because you have things like a Spanish guitar randomly, the synthesizer coming in at one song randomly, the constant presence of the Jew's harp. But it never really felt to me, it didn't hit me, I guess, in the way that it sounds like it might have hit you guys with the emotional resonance.
And I don't know if like the emotional resonance, it's actually interesting because I feel like there was some part of a turnoff of it because it was so dark. The song with the Nancy song about the suicide, it was just very, very sad.
It was an incredible song lyrically.
Sure.
That's what I'm getting at. But I felt like I was hearing him talk about someone else. It wasn't as if I was hearing him processing it. It was almost as like a reporter reporting on this, which was great. But compared to like a Townes Van Zandt where it's like, man, this guy's lived through some stuff. I never, you know what I mean? Like I